We are in this great little story of Ruth. If you have a Bible, go to Ruth chapter 2. If you don't have a Bible, there's a Bible underneath the seat in front of you somewhere, and we're on page 223 in that Bible. But it's this great little story. It begins with a guy named Elimelech, and they live in this little town called Bethlehem. He lives with his wife Naomi and their two sons, and a famine hits, so Elimelech makes a really, really bad decision to take Naomi and their two boys out of Israel, away from the presence of God, away from the provision of God, away from the people of God, and they move to the country of Moab. And they get to Moab. It's a nation that worshiped the false god called Chemosh, and they are a nation that mocks Israel's God. They live there for 10 years. The two sons have taken Moabite wives. They are pagan, unbelieving wives that do not worship the one true God. They have no children, and the one thing that they were trying to avoid actually happens. Elimelech dies, their two sons die, and now it's just Naomi and they're in Moab, away from God's presence, away from God's people. Naomi and Ruth decide. Ruth, Naomi's mother-in-law, who has now become a worshiper of the God of Israel, they decide to make their way back. Well, Naomi makes the decision. Ruth says, "I'm going with you," and they go back to Bethlehem in Israel, and they arrive broken. They are empty. And Naomi, she does not try to cover at all. She is broken. She is bitter. She does not like the situation that she is in. She believes certainly that God's hand has come against her. Ruth takes it upon herself then to be the one, like somebody's got to do something. Like, we got to eat. And so Ruth is going, "Hey, I'm going to go out to the field. I'm going to try to find us some grain so that we can have something to eat tonight." And that's where we left off in chapter 2. And so Naomi says, "Okay, go ahead and go." And she says this, Ruth says, "I'm going to go and find favor because I don't believe God has abandoned us. I believe that these are really hard circumstances. We are grieving the loss of our family, but I don't believe that God has abandoned us. I believe that He's in it. I believe that He's with us, that He's doing something." And so she goes out into the field and she said, "I'm going to go find favor. I'm going to find somebody who will let me pick up scraps in their field." This was quite the risk for Ruth to not only go into the field, and it certainly would have been a risk to go out on her own into the field in Israel, in Bethlehem, but it was a risk just for her to move to Israel. For her to leave Moab. Moabites were not well thought of, as you can imagine, in Israel. Yet she still believed, no, God is in control, and that He's doing something in the midst of this brokenness. And what makes this story so great is that this is just ordinary life. Like, there's nothing crazy happening here. It's just people just doing life. They're raising a family. They're grieving the loss of family. They're trying to make ends meet. There are no miracles in this story, and yet God's sovereign hand is all over it. It's all over it. We see God's providence. He's ordering and controlling what is happening to fulfill His purpose through what seems to just be just ordinary life, which is really good news for us because that's our life, right? Like, our life is just ordinary. It's just ordinary stuff. We don't see waters part and bread come out of heaven like most days of our life. It's mainly just get up, you go to school, you go to work. It's school stuff, it's job stuff, it's family stuff, it's friend stuff. You get a paycheck to pay the bills, and then you go to bed and you wake up and you do it all over again. Like, this is essentially our life. It's just ordinary stuff. It's just ordinary life. And yet there are times in our life we see that God's providence, through all of the ordinariness of our life, God's providence was at work and He was doing something. Like, we look back, there are times that we just look back and go, well, I know I took that job and I was just taking that job because it was a better fit, it was more money or whatever it was in the community we want to live in, whatever it was. But looking back, we think, well, I'm not sure that was like an accident. I'm not sure that was just me making a decision. I think God was doing something in that. Like, looking back, I think that was God's providence. I think God was doing something here. We look at times in our life where we weren't sure how we were going to make it, and we weren't sure what was going to happen, and yet we look back and we go, well, we made it, and God provided. Look what He did. And when we see God's hand in all of it, we look back and we see God's hand was all over it, it changes us. Like it leads us to be a people of humility. It leads us to be a people of gratitude. This is what's happening here. Ruth, she tells her broken and bitter mother-in-law, hey, I'm going to go to the field and I'm going to find favor. I'm going to find somebody to let me just pick up scraps so we can eat tonight. In the field she comes to, which the scriptures, the writer says of this story, says it just so happened to belong to this guy named Boaz. It just, as luck would have it, the writer is really trying to drive home a point, like, no, God is doing something. As luck would have it, as it turns out, it just happened to belong to this guy, his Boaz. And it just so happens that Boaz is a really great guy. He's a really great guy. He's a man of strength. His name means strength, but he is a man, he lives up to his name. He's a man of strength. He's a man of influence. He's a man of wealth. He's got a business. He's got a crew. He knows what he's doing, but he loves God and he trusts God. And he hears about what Ruth has done, this woman who has come from Moab and now has taken upon Naomi, this woman to be this mother-in-law to be like her responsibility, and now she's with her, taking care of her. And so he hears about all of this, and so he goes to her and he makes sure that she is safe in his field. And he introduces her to his employees. He gives her the same rights as his own employees. And Ruth cannot believe what is happening. She just is going, I'm going to go out to the field, and hopefully I can find a field where the owner won't beat me and he'll allow me to pick up the scraps. That was like the hopes that she had. It was like, that's how high it was. Like, I just don't want to get beat. I just want to get some food and come back and serve us dinner and maybe breakfast in the morning. And yet what she finds was far beyond what she was hoping for. And so it goes on. Verse 14, it says, in the mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. So here's the thing. This is like Hallmark season, right? Like some of y'all know what I'm talking about. Like it's Hallmark season. This is when Hallmark flourishes. This is where, like, this is it. This is Hallmark. And so I think what happens when we read a verse like that in this story, we're kind of conditioned to think, oh, this is like their first date, right? It's kind of what we're thinking. It's like, oh, it's so romantic. But listen, that is not what this is. All right, there's nothing romantic about this. Nothing romantic going on here. There's none of that happening. We've got a woman who's just trying to get some food, and a man who's just owns a field and said, yeah, you can have some food here, and I'll make sure that none of the guys, mess with you. So yeah, this is lunch break is what this is, all right? This isn't some like moment. This is lunch break. That's all. So Ruth is still hanging out on the outskirts of the field. She has no food for lunch. She didn't bring a lunch bag. She has no bag and she has no food. So Boaz invites her to have lunch with everyone else. If you remember, this is how it went. This is how it went down. She's on the edge because she's one of the poor, and so she's given so much food that she has leftovers. Verse 15. It says, and when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, hey, let her glean among even the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and just leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. And so again, she would have been on the edges of the field because this is where the poor go. This is the way God had set it up, told the harvesters, this is the law. Don't glean or don't harvest all the way to the edge of your field. Leave the edges for the poor. And then if you drop anything while you're gleaning, and you're harvesting, don't pick up your scraps. Just leave it. Just leave it for the poor. This Ruth, she's the poor. She's gleaning on the edges. This is where she's been. And all of a sudden, Boaz says, hey, you don't need to be on the edges. Why don't you come in on the middle? Like get in on the middle. I want you to take from the best of the crop, and that the crop that's already been harvested. And he even tells his guys to pull some from the bundles. Like pull some of that good stuff from the bundles and just leave it there and just let her pick it up. And then he goes, listen, and when you're out there, I don't want to hear he's telling his guys, I don't want to hear any jokes about Moabites, right? And if she doesn't know what she's doing, like, leave her alone. Like, don't rebuke her for it. Just let her be. He goes on. It says, so she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. An ephah is about, it's somewhere between 30 pounds and 50 pounds of grain. That's what we're talking about. I couldn't find. I was reading different scholars, and some said it was right around 50 pounds. The smallest amount that I saw was it would have been about 30 pounds. So somewhere between 30 and 50 pounds of grain is what she was able to reap on this day. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. And she also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. So picture this in your mind. She's got 30 to 50 pounds of grain in one hand, and she's got a to-go box from lunch in her other hand. And she drags this through the door and shows, like, hey, this is what we got today. Like, this is what it is, Naomi. I went out looking for favor. Here it is. Here's favor. Two things we learn here. One, Ruth is no joke, right? Like, she's buff. Like, she's got it going on. I mean, she's got some guns. And two, she's broke, but she's generous, right? She didn't have anything, but what she does have, she makes sure that Naomi has enough. Now, can you imagine Naomi's face when she saw Ruth hauling this stuff in, like hauling this bag of grain? Like, can you imagine, like, what she was thinking? Like, the last thing that Ruth said to Naomi was, hey, I'm going to go to the field that I might find favor. And here comes Ruth with enough food, literally, to feed them for months. Well, you catch a bit of her excitement here in 19. It says, and her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. And it's like Ruth is going, okay, just let me, like, take a breath. Let me just get myself together here. And so she's just excited. And so she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I worked with today is Boaz. And it had to be the moment where Naomi is going, Boaz. Of course. She knows what this means. Ruth has no clue. But it's all coming together for Naomi. Naomi is beginning to see God's providential hand at work in her life and Ruth's life. And it really has nothing to do with the 30 pounds of grain that she just hauled in. It says, and Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. Redeemers. I wonder if Ruth had any idea what Naomi was talking about when she said he's one of our redeemers. Well, if she didn't know, she will. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. In other words, Naomi, this wasn't just a good day. Like, it's going to be a good 6 weeks. In fact, it's going to be a good year. Because I get to harvest, like the rest of harvest, like I'm invited back in. I get to harvest all day for the next 6 weeks in the field gathering food for the both of us. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you not go out, or that you do go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of barley and wheat harvests. And she lived with her mother-in-law. What we see in this story is we see that Ruth and Boaz, and eventually Naomi, live their lives very aware of the sovereign hand of God working out and playing into their provision. We see it played out right here. I mean, we see Ruth. Something we see from Ruth is she has got a grateful attitude. She never complains. But listen, if she were to sit across from you and she were to tell you her story, you would say, oh, you got a lot to complain about. There's what in the world? But instead, she has a grateful attitude. When she encounters favor from Boaz, you don't find Ruth going, well, finally, God, finally you show up. Finally, you give us a little breathing room here. I mean, finally. No. When Boaz shows up and gives her favor, she says, who am I that I would find favor? She has a grateful attitude. And then Ruth is just somebody who just gets stuff done. She just gets stuff done. She never gives excuses. She never feels sorry for herself. She has a lot of reasons to be depressed, for sure. She's got a lot of reasons to just not get up in the morning, but she gets up every day, doesn't make excuses. She doesn't feel sorry for herself. She does what she needs to do, just get it done. And what's more, she takes responsibility not only for herself, but she makes her life more difficult by taking on Naomi as her own responsibility. Like her old bitter mother-in-law. Like, I'm going to take her on. And I'm not just going to provide for me. I'm going to take her as well. How in the world does Ruth do this? How does she go about this time of her life with no complaining and no excuses? Like, how does she do this? Because she realizes that difficult days and difficult seasons, they're not a sign that God has abandoned her, but that God's providential hand is at work especially in the hard stuff. That the hard days and the hard years are actually a platform for God to make himself known, to show off who he is. And then you have Boaz. I mean, Boaz at his core, he's the same way. I mean, he's in different circumstances for sure. But do you want to know what it looks like for someone whose life is going seemingly well to live with humility and gratitude? Look at Boaz. Like, Boaz is an example of grace. Like, how is it that people are going to come to know who God is? Like, how is it that people get to know, like, this invisible God? And you just can't say, hey, there he is right there. Hey, no, he's right here. Hey, I was having a conversation with God, and hey, tell him what you told me. Like, how are people going to come to know this God? It's through his people. That's how. It's through his people. This is the way, and this is what Boaz understood. It happened. This is what we see. He takes care of people, and then along the way, he just points them to God. He shows up at the job site, and he's the guy. He's the boss man. And he shows up at the guy at the field, and here he is. He's just to all of his crew, all of his workers. He's going, hey, the Lord be with you today. And then he goes over the top in provision and protection for this woman from Moab, of all places. And when she bows down to him and says, why have I found favor? He doesn't say, well, because I'm awesome. But he says, because God is awesome. That's why you found favor. It's this protection and provision that I've brought you, Ruth, is actually the provision of God and the protection of God. God is protecting you. God is providing for you. The reason that Boaz can be so generous is because he is someone who understands God's sovereign hand of provision. Boaz is also someone who just lives with a grateful attitude. That God was generous with him so that he could be generous with others while pointing them to God. And we also see this in the way that the way Boaz values others, by crossing economic, social, and racial lines. Again, Boaz is the man. Like, he's the man. I mean, he's the boss. In that culture, they would have called Boaz the Lord of the harvest. That's what he carried. He's the Lord of the harvest. Here comes the Lord of the harvest. That's Boaz. This is the status that Boaz had. And yet, at lunchtime, where is Boaz sitting? He sits with the crew. He sits with the workers. And then he brings this Moabite woman to the table, and he doesn't do what is customary and tell the woman to serve the guys. He, the boss man, the Lord of the harvest, serves the Moabite. You know, it's crazy that in our history, not all that long ago, that we were separating black people from white people. And we didn't call it sin. You know what we called it? We called it Christian. Deuteronomy 7. This is God's instructions to his people. They had been in Israel or they had been in Egypt as slaves for 400 years, and God rescues them, and they've been in the wilderness roaming around for 40 years, and now he's bringing them into the land that he said, I'm giving you. But it's already inhabited by these people, and they are all worshiping these false gods, and so you're going to go in, and I'm going to give you victory over all of them, and you're going to take this land, and you're going to be my people, and you're going to be a light to the world to show who I am, the one true God. So here's the instructions that he gives. He says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And he's in what he's mentioning is, hey, these are 7 nations that have more people than you do. They're stronger than you will ever be. He says, and when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons. This is the kind of passage that Christians would use to support opposition to interracial marriage. I remember growing up, and I just thought, whenever I would see a couple, one was white, one was black, particularly, as a kid growing up, in my mind, I would go, oh, well, that's not right. They must not be Christian, because that's sinful. But listen, this has nothing to do with race. That was not what was behind God's instruction to not marry those that are outside of your. It has nothing to do with race. This has everything to do with faith. Culturally speaking, those outside of Israel in those days, they like all of these, the Canaanites, the Jebusites, the Hittites, they all worshiped false gods. They all worship false gods. And so what God is saying is, I don't want you to go, when you go in there, I don't want your sons marrying their daughters and your daughters marrying their sons. And it has nothing to do with like the color of your skin or the race or the culture that you come from. It has nothing to do with that. Zero. This is about believers marrying unbelievers. This isn't about white people marrying black people. That's not what this is. Here's what he says. This is how he gives the reason. He says, this is why I don't want your sons marrying their daughters and your daughter. This is it. Or they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Paul says in Acts chapter 17, he says this. He says, and God made from one man, meaning Adam, God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. This is our reality, that we all come from the same place. There's only one group, those that have been created and made by God. That's it. And we're all in the same group. Doesn't matter what color your skin is or what your heritage is. Boaz is a man who understands the grace, the favor that God has given him, and he is grateful, and it shows in how he values others, how he crosses over status of economic status and social status or race. Boaz is looking at Ruth going, like, you might look a little bit different than I do. You might talk a little bit different than I do because you got a different language. But you worship the same God that I worship. The only difference between us is where we were born. This is what a grateful attitude does. This is someone who understands that had it not been for the sovereign hand of God, I wouldn't have anything. I would be nothing. And so the question is, are you a grateful person? Or are you an entitled person? Are you grateful or are you entitled? There's a few questions that that just in thinking through these questions perhaps might reveal to you, might bring some clarity to you of where on the scale do you fall from grateful to entitled. For instance, like when you watch certain shows, like in particular, home improvement shows. And this, honestly, I brought this, like this was the first question I wrote down because this is what really kind of got to me, kind of revealed some stuff in me that I didn't like. When you watch home improvement shows, like you see like what they turned that into, because they just have a small budget of $700,000, and what can you do? I mean, it's all we got. I mean, so what can you do? And then you look at that, and what happens in you when you watch those kinds of shows? I know what happens to me. I hate my house. Is what happens to me. Is what happens. That's it. Or speaking of Hallmark, when you watch your Hallmark movies, what does that make you feel? Like you see this, it's the same movie, right? 10,000 different ways. And I watched one last night. But listen, when you watch these movies, how does it make you feel? Like, how does it make you feel about, if you're a wife in here, how does that make you feel about your husband or your marriage? It's like, I don't see us showing up at Christmas tree lightings and kissing in the snow, and my husband would never do that. And like, what is that? Like, my marriage is just a disaster after like this. Or what about this? When you're driving in the left lane, like the passing lane, and the car in front of you is going slower than what you desire, what do you feel in that moment? Like, what rises up in you in that moment? When you pray, what are your prayers filled with? Are they filled with thankfulness, gratefulness, or are they filled with asking God for stuff? And listen, the Bible tells us we should ask. James says you don't have because you haven't asked. You should ask. But even in the asking, what's the end to that? Like, are you asking because this is just I really want? It's going to make my life comfortable. It's just what I want God to fulfill all of my desires. But what's on the end of that? Like, what's the goal here? Or is it, God, if you, as far as I can tell, if you would answer this prayer, this would bring you much glory. Would you do that? Or where are you? What do your prayers reveal about where you fall on the scale of gratitude and entitled? In your last, say, 100 texts that you've sent, are they mostly thank yous or tasks or just full of complaints about situations or somebody? When's the last time you shared the gospel with someone? Is there unforgiveness that you're holding on to? we could go on and on and on, but for my sake and my comfort, how I just would rather not, because it's pretty convicting, isn't it? I think it can give you an idea of where your life is on the scale. Like we say one thing, but then when I think about my life and how I respond to certain things and what the words that come out of my mouth or onto my phone, like what does that say about where I fall on this scale? But here's the thing. If you find yourself kind of hanging out on the entitled end of things, good news is you can be changed. We can be changed. This is what we see in Naomi. Naomi loses her husband, she loses her 2 sons, and she's sure that God's hand is against her. And so she's coming home and she's going, don't call me Naomi. Everybody's like, is that Naomi? She's like, stop calling me Naomi. Naomi means sweet. I am not sweet. Call me Mara. It means bitter. That sounds like my life. And she's just not okay with her circumstances, and she's pretty sure that God has done all of this, but he's doing it to spite her. I don't know, but this is the woman that Ruth is out there sweating, breaking her back to bring food home to. I don't know. This isn't like the point of this story, but I don't know if you've caught on to this, but aren't you a bit challenged by Ruth's example of grace toward Naomi? I mean, Ruth chose to stay with Naomi. Do you find it difficult to love bitter people? Is it challenging for you to serve people that are difficult? Man, what an example Ruth gives us to love the Naomis in our lives, to love them the way Christ has shown love to us, yet how he came to us to serve us, lay down his life for us. Man, I don't know about you, but I know that Jesus has shown much patience and grace toward me. And people will come to see who Jesus is by me showing that kind of patience and grace toward others, even the most bitter, difficult people in my life. And it's an encounter with God's kindness through the kindness of Boaz that tips Naomi over into gratitude. It says, and her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today, and where have you worked? And blessed be the man who took notice of you. She told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, look, the man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. This kindness, the Hebrew word for kindness here is hesed or hesed. It's a word that means it's a loyal love. It's an unfailing kindness. Naomi is putting this together through the kindness of this man Boaz. Naomi goes from God's hand, it's against me, I'm telling you, and I'm bitter about it, to God's kindness has not forsaken us. That is, his kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Who is she talking about when she says the living or the dead? That God's kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. What's she talking about? She's saying that the Lord has shown kindness and faithfulness to her entire family, to her whole family, to her and Ruth, who are living now by and he has been shown kindness to them by providing for them food, but also kindness to their husbands, to her Elimelech and to her 2 sons, to Ruth's husband who have died. How is it that God is showing kindness to the dead ones? Well, it seems that Naomi is hinting at that there is hope here with Boaz to be the kinsman redeemer, the one who might take Ruth to be his wife and carry on this family line. That's how God is showing kindness to her 2 boys, or to at least one of her sons and her husband. That this family will go on. She's hoping she sees it through Boaz, this kinsman redeemer. Naomi, she's experiencing a bit of a personal revival here. Her view of God is being restored. Her bitterness is being replaced with thankfulness. Where Naomi could only see bitterness in her situation, she's beginning to see that God has not abandoned her. But in fact, his kindness has never left her. Listen, if you are in a season of grief, a season where just from observing the circumstances of your life, where all evidence of God's kindness seem to be nowhere to be found, allow Naomi's turnaround to encourage you. God has not abandoned you. He has not removed his goodness and kindness and faithfulness from your life. He never changes. He is only ever good and faithful and kind to his sons and daughters. The world is broken and we experience pain and disappointment, but the darkness has not and cannot and will not overcome the light. Psalm 30 says, weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning. God's favor, his grace, it never quits. It doesn't just show up for a season and then it goes away and then it comes back. That it never quits. He is sovereign over all of the circumstances of your life. So because of God's grace that never quits, and because God is sovereign, this is how we know it is possible to go from mourning to dancing. But listen, to experience that in your life, it begins with an attitude of gratitude. If all you can think about is what you don't have, it will be almost impossible for you to be thankful to God for what you do have. Look, we're all wired with certain personalities. They don't really change throughout the course of our life. I was an introvert, I think, in the womb, and I am an introvert today, right now. It's kind of like we all kind of have these personalities, our own personality that's unique to us, and it typically just doesn't change over the course of our life. But attitudes do change and can change. And can be changed. This is why Paul can say in Philippians 2, make your own attitude that of Christ Jesus. Make your attitude like that of Christ Jesus. And we're like, well, what kind of attitude did Jesus have? He goes on. He says, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Jesus, being God himself, he didn't come to us and leverage his strength and leverage his godness for himself, but for others. Jesus had a grateful attitude. He wasn't entitled, but he was, even though he was legitimately entitled. It says this, but he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. And then he throws this word in there, therefore. Now, we talk about this a lot, that when you read the Bible, you need to pay attention to certain clues in the Bible so you can get the full meaning of what the Bible is trying to tell you. And one of those clues that we look for in the scripture is the word therefore. Therefore isn't a word that just stands on its own. It's there to connect two thoughts, what's before it and what's coming. In other words, what I'm getting ready to say has everything to do with what I just said. This is what he wants us to know. Jesus, he emptied himself and became a man, a servant of men. He humbled himself to the point of death on a humiliating cross for crimes he did not do. Therefore, so in light of what I'm getting ready to say, don't forget this. This is what happened. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. In other words, what looked like God's not paying attention, Jesus shows up. What's going on? He's being beaten and mocked and crucified. What is happening here? He's humbled himself. He's serving the people that are the enemies. Where it seemed like God was not paying attention, what looked like a setback was actually a setup for God to show off who he is. That the suffering and the hardship was the stage that God set up so that God could be clearly seen. And this is what happens in this story. Ruth and Boaz, they both had an attitude of gratitude because they both understood that God was sovereign over their provision. This hardship that I'm walking through, the husband's dying, homeless, we have no food. This isn't God is still at work. He's still good. He's still faithful. His kindness has not left us. He's still providing. This is what Ruth and Boaz understood. That God was sovereign over their provision. For Boaz, it was, I have much, and God is sovereign over what I have, so I give it away. Because God is the one that is doing it. He gave me this to work out his plan. And God's grace entered into their situation. And as we will see through Ruth and Boaz, literally, God changed the world. And this is what God will do through your life. Look, there's nothing that you can do to earn your salvation. Your salvation does not depend upon you. But there is something that you can do that brings God's grace into your circumstances and to others through you. James, and I believe Peter as well, both said something of the sort. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. He opposes the proud and gives grace. He gets in on the humble. And so Paul, he goes on. He says, therefore, so this is what Jesus has done. He came to us, servant. He humbled himself to the point of death, even death on the cross, the most humiliating kind of death at the time. Therefore, God highly exalted him, gave him the name above every name. Every knee in heaven and earth will bow. Every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And he goes on, he says, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now he's talking to us, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. In other words, when God saves you, he puts his spirit in you to work out what God is working in. In other words, if you are saved, there are things that God is doing, he is working in you that will eventually find their way out. There are things that God is working in you, things like love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. God is doing these things, working these things in you. Why? Because he wants to work them out of you. He wants you to work them out. And through working them out, people will see who he is. This is what God is. God's doing this in you to play out his sovereign plan through your life. And here, Paul specifically mentions something that God is working in you to make God known throughout the world. Here's something that God is doing in you if you're a follower of Jesus so that he can work through you. Here it is. This is in the same passage. We've not gone off. The same passage. Jesus humbled himself, was exalted. Now he says, do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. In other words, you want to change your school? You want to change your home? You want to change your office? You want to change your neighborhood? You want to change the world? just go about life doing all the things that you do without grumbling or complaining. Do all things that you do in this ordinary life without complaining or arguing. So let's just like take this week at school, all right? Just take this week, or take this week at your job, or in your house, your family. Just this week. That's it. Just this 1 week, and just don't complain once. Like not once. Like just don't complain at all. Some of you're gonna have to stay like silent the entire week, right? Just don't complain. Just this 1 week, just don't complain at all. Just don't complain, not one word of complaining, and see what happens. And people will be asking, what happened to you? What's going on? Are you on some new medication? Like what? What's going on? What's happening with you? Because listen, gratitude is contagious. It changes people. This is what happened with Naomi. Ruth lived her life in the midst of horrible circumstances with humility and gratitude, losing a husband, losing a future seemingly, losing the chance of any kind of family, children, anything. And she lives this life in the midst of it all with humility and gratitude. And what happens? It changes Naomi. It changed Naomi. Naomi recognized the goodness and faithfulness of God through Ruth. When you live your life focused on what God has done for you in Christ, you will not be able to maintain an entitled attitude focused on your circumstances. But you will find yourself living out an attitude of gratitude and humility. I ran across this quote just last night, and I thought it was so helpful. It's a guy by the name of D.A. Carson. He said this. He said, Christians will take refuge from their questions about suffering, not in bitterness, not in self-pity, not in resentment against God or trite religious cliches. Like, that's not how you find refuge from your suffering. But in endurance, perseverance, and faith in the God who has suffered, who has fought with evil and triumphed, and whose power and goodness ensure that faith resting in him will never, ever be disappointed. This is what we get when our refuge is in God. This is what we get when our refuge is in him. When I'm not determining, my attitude is not determined by the circumstances that I'm walking in. My understanding of God and where he is and what he's doing is not being determined by how difficult or how easy my circumstances are today. But I'm finding my refuge in God as Boaz says to Ruth, under the wings of God. That no matter what this looks like, no matter how difficult life is right now, no matter how out of control it seems to be, one thing I do know is that God is in control. And he is faithful and he is kind. And his kindness never quits. His grace never quits. Whatever my life looks like right now, I can't always trust what I see. That what looks like a setback is only a setup for God to bring glory to himself. And when God brings glory to himself, listen, we talk about this a lot, and I hope this is beginning to find its way into your heart. Whenever you hear that God is bringing glory to himself in your situation, you should always hear, simultaneously, you should hear with that will always turn out for my good. God's glory and your good go hand in hand. So if God is doing something in your life, and it's hard. This is a hard season. But if you know God is doing something here, God is doing something for his glory, then you have to say immediately after that, and if he's doing it for his glory, then I know he's doing it for my good. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, Naomi, that you shall keep close my young men until they finish all my harvest. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with these young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest. And she lived with her mother-in-law. And there you have it. She meets this guy, Boaz. He protects her. I mean, the harvest season's like 6-8 weeks long. She'd been there with him, under his protection, provision for all this time. Certainly they had other conversations. He provided for her and Naomi. They have more than enough food now for a year. Barley season is over, and she's living with her mother-in-law. Nothing is said about Boaz. It's just Naomi and Ruth. So now what? Well, we'll find out in chapter 3.